tank of gas? Does he boots on the wood, let the whiskey pass? I ain't preaching from a pulpit, I'm talking from the scar. You can dress up a lie, but it won't get far. They call it toxic when it burns your tongue. I call it true when it's finally sung. Got a dog-eared Bible of the things they hide, and a match for the curtains, let the daylight shine. You want comfort? Son, you missed your turn. This road's called real and the edges burn. Honesty don't whisper, it kicks down doors. So brace yourself for what the jukebox is for. This is FAFO, holler it loud. Fuck around with fiction, get the facts drawn. Getting triggers just the cost of the crowd. We're toxic to the lies, truth we're proud. This is FAFO, no smooth talk, no vow. You brought your stories, we brought the real. Now run your mouth and meet the South down. Fuck around and find out, burn it down. Muddy water don't care about your brand new shoes. And facts don't care which team you choose.
Welcome once again to the FAFO Podcast. This is our second episode in our How America Was Born series, celebrating the 250th anniversary of the birth of the United States of America. And yesterday we talked about the beginning of the revolution, how it got started. And today we're going to talk about how America refused to die. So get ready. This is against impossible odds. And I thought, as I was looking at this, I need a good tagline. I need something that really emphasizes how fragile this whole experiment was from the jump. Because there never should have been a United States. This is the story of how it survived anyway. You see, by the end of 1776, America was losing, not struggling, not fighting to a draw. They were losing. The Declaration of Independence had been signed. The world knew the colonies had declared themselves free, but there was only one small problem. Nobody knew if they could stay free. The British Army was the greatest fighting force on earth at the time. They had professional soldiers, veteran officers, the world's most powerful navy, unlimited resources, and the Americans, they were farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, merchants, men whose military experience often consisted of hunting deer and chasing wolves off the family farm. Washington had already suffered devastating defeats around New York, including Long Island, Manhattan, White Plains, Fort Washington, Fort Lee. And each defeat pushed the Continental Army farther south. The Army wasn't just losing battles. It was falling apart. Men were starving. Many had no shoes. Uniforms were little more than rags. Supplies were almost non-existent. Disease spread through camp. Desertions increased every week. Enlistments were about to expire. Many soldiers planned to go home after Christmas, and think about that. The American Revolution had barely begun, and it was already on life support. Had Britain landed just one final knockout blow, history would probably remember the revolution as nothing more than a failed rebellion. There would be no United States, no Constitution, no Bill of Rights, no 4th of July, no American experiment. Everything rested on one exhausted army, led by a man who absolutely refused to quit. And tonight we're telling the story of how America survived its darkest hour, because sometimes victory doesn't belong to the strongest. It belongs to the ones who simply refuse to surrender. America wasn't won because we were stronger. It was won because we refused to stay beaten. If you missed our episode from yesterday, and you'd like to catch up, it's easy to do. All you got to do is hop over to Spotify. You can find us there at the FAFO Podcast or Apple Podcast or Amazon Music. Check out any of those, and you can jump right in and catch right up. We have tons of these things. If you'd like to support us, go to the FAFO Podcast online. You see it scrolling across the bottom of your screen. Go there, support us. Catch all the episodes, buy some great merch, show your support and love for the FAFO Podcast. As we get into this one, so when we think of Christmas, we think of all these celebrations, we think of Santa Claus and the gift giving and all the fun things that we get to do at Christmas time. But back in 1776, it was different. You see, we're almost going to celebrate the 4th of July here in a couple of days, depending on when you're listening to this. This has been recorded on July the 2nd. And when we celebrate the 4th of July, it's easy to imagine that once the Declaration of Independence was signed, America simply marched from one glorious victory to the next. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, by December of 1776, just 5 months after declaring independence, the American Revolution was on the verge of complete collapse. If you had been alive at the time, you probably wouldn't have bet a nickel on America winning. The Declaration of Independence had certainly inspired people, but a declaration isn't a victory. It doesn't stop bullets, doesn't feed soldiers, doesn't win battles. The ink on the Declaration had barely dried before the British Empire came crashing down on the colonies with overwhelming force. Now, to understand just how desperate things became, you got to go back to the summer of 1776. Because after they evacuated Boston earlier that year, the British changed their strategy entirely. Instead of trying to crush scattered resistance in New England, they decided to capture the most important city in the colonies, New York. General William Howe arrived with one of the largest military expeditions the British Empire had ever assembled. Over 32,000 soldiers, including thousands of experienced British regulars and nearly 9,000 Hessian mercenaries hired from the German states, sailed into New York Harbor aboard hundreds of ships. I mean, imagine this breathtaking display of just military power rolling across the water. The British Navy stretched across the horizon. I mean, cannons lined the decks. Professional soldiers filled transport ships. I mean, to many Americans, this had to look unstoppable. And standing against them was George Washington and roughly 20,000 Continental soldiers. And calling them an army might even be generous. But think about this. Many had little to no training. They didn't. Some carried hunting rifles instead of muskets, those military muskets they had, right? The uniforms were all inconsistent. Supplies were scarce. There was no discipline. Washington wasn't commanding seasoned veterans here. He was commanding volunteers, your teachers and farmers, your millers, young boys, old men, just ordinary citizens who answered the call because they believed something extraordinary was worth fighting for. Americans had already looked at themselves as their own little world over here at the time. All the colonies were individual countries in and to themselves. But now they were finding themselves coming together for something that they had never intended on doing in the first place. But then came the Battle of Long Island. That was in August of 1776, and it was a disaster for the Continental Army. I mean, British forces brilliantly outmaneuvered Washington. They did. They flanked him. They flanked the American lines and nearly trapped his entire army against the East River. And it was only a miraculous nighttime evacuation that saved the revolution. There was a thick fog that night, and under the cover of darkness and that fog that settled over the river, the following morning, thousands of American soldiers quietly crossed back to Manhattan in small boats. Had the British attacked just a few hours earlier, Washington's army may well have ceased to exist. And think about that. The American Revolution could have ended before it was even 6 weeks old. And the defeats kept coming. Washington lost Manhattan. He lost Harlem Heights after some initial success there. And then he lost the White Plains. And then probably the biggest blow of all was Fort Washington. Do you know there were more than 2,800 American soldiers were captured in a single day? And thousands desperately needed muskets, cannons, powder. All these supplies they needed so badly fell into the British hands. And just days later, Fort Lee was abandoned. And Washington ordered yet another retreat. I mean, for nearly a month, Washington's army, exhausted, marched south, staying just ahead of pursuing British forces. They crossed muddy roads and frozen fields and rain and snow and bitter cold. Many soldiers no longer had boots. They had worn them out. Men had to wrap cloth around their feet, rags, because those shoes had literally fallen apart. Others marched barefoot. The frozen ground became stained with blood. Imagine that sight. One officer later described following the army by the bloody footprints left behind in the snow. Now imagine trying to fight the most powerful and the greatest military on earth at the time. As you're barefoot, you're hungry, you're cold, and you're still marching. Of course, morale's going to collapse. Then you have all these enlistments that are going to expire on December 31st, and many soldiers just wanted to go home. They had volunteered for a year. The year was almost over. Some had farms that needed tending, families that hadn't seen, children who barely remember them. Every day, more men deserted. Others simply disappeared during the night. And by December, Washington's once proud army had shrunk dramatically. He often had fewer than 5,000 effectives capable of fighting. And some days there were far fewer than that. And Congress wasn't exactly inspiring confidence. I mean, look at this. As British forces advanced, members of Continental Congress fled Philadelphia, fearing the city might soon be captured. And to ordinary Americans, this had to look like everything was just coming apart. Everything was unraveling before their eyes. I mean, the British certainly thought so. General Howe himself believed victory was essentially inevitable. And many British officers expected the rebellion to collapse before spring. Why wouldn't they think this? They had won nearly every major battle. The Americans were retreating. Congress was fleeing. Soldiers were deserting. Loyalists throughout the colonies believed British victory was only a matter of time. The Crown even began offering pardons. Lay down your weapons, swear loyalty to King George III, and go home. That's it. And for many colonists exhausted by war, it was a tempting offer, and some did accept it. Others simply waited to see which side would win. And the revolution stood on the edge of extinction. But then something remarkable happened. Not on a battlefield, not in Congress, but through the power of words. There was a struggling writer. You may have heard of him. If you hadn't, shame on you. Thomas Paine. He sat down and wrote a pamphlet that would reignite an army. Its title was The American Crisis. And it opened with these words that have echoed through American history ever since. At some point in your life, you've heard them. These are the times that try men's souls. Paine didn't sugarcoat the situation. He admitted things were terrible. He acknowledged the fear. He acknowledged the hardship. But he argued that difficult times reveal true character. He said, the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. And those words struck like lightning. Washington understood their power immediately. Before one of the most important military operations in American history, he ordered Payne's essay read aloud to his exhausted soldiers. Imagine standing in the freezing cold, your clothes in tatters, your feet bleeding, your enlistment almost over, you haven't been paid, you've lost battle after battle, you don't know if you'll live another week. And then someone begins reading those words. These are the times that try men's souls. It reminded the Army why they were there, not because victory was guaranteed, but because freedom had always demanded sacrifice. Payne understood something that every great leader eventually learns. Armies don't fight solely because they're well armed. They fight because they believe in something. Washington had nearly run out of supplies. He nearly run out of soldiers. He had almost run out of time, but he hadn't run out of resolve. And as Christmas approached, Washington realized something terrifying. If he did nothing, the revolution would almost certainly die. His soldiers' enlistments would expire. The army would dissolve. Britain would spend the winter consolidating its victories. By spring, there might not even be a continental army left to fight. And the only remaining option here was the most dangerous one imaginable: attack. Against overwhelming odds, in the middle of winter, attack across an ice-filled river on Christmas night. It sounded insane, but attack. And this is exactly why Washington believed it might work. You see, because sometimes the greatest victories are born from moments of absolute desperation. And sometimes history turns because one man refuses to accept defeat. The fate of the United States now rested on the decision that would become one of the most daring military gambles ever attempted. George Washington was about to cross the Delaware River, and with him, the hopes of an entire nation. Imagine crossing the Delaware, this river, in the middle of the night. It's getting rough outside. The blizzard's coming. You have no clothing, no protection from the cold. Do you remember the famous painting? It's a beautiful painting. And it symbolizes this whole thing, right? It's become synonymous with George Washington. It's Emanuel Lutz's famous painting of him standing heroically in a boat, right? You got one foot on the bow, staring defiantly into the distance as ice chunks float around him, and the American flag waves behind his head. Now, it's one of the most recognizable paintings in American history. And, of course, it's almost entirely inaccurate. Some people say Washington wasn't certainly standing, but that's been debated. If they were on Durham boats, which used to carry cargo, men, supplies, cattle, I mean, he could very well, if he was standing on one of those, he could very well have been standing up. The flag in the painting hadn't even been designed yet. Well, and there was that. So there were, while the painting itself is inspirational, the reality is even more incredible than the painting. Because what actually happened on Christmas night in 1776 wasn't symbolic. It was desperate. I mean, Washington understood by that Christmas the revolution wasn't merely losing. It was just hours away from collapsing. He knew it. And he knew he had to get desperate and do something. He knew there was nothing else he could do. He had to attack. And it's wild to see that when we go into attack mode, when we realize that the only thing we can do is move forward, how focused you become. I mean, think about this. Again, soldiers not paid, had no winter clothing, no proper meals in days, feet wrapped in rags, marching through the ice and snow. There's disease that had spread through the camps. There was nothing positive happening for them. And yet he inspired them to march on that Christmas night, a promise of an attack on Trenton, New Jersey, where what awaited them in Trenton? 1,400 Hessian soldiers. Now, here's the thing about the Hessians. Many Americans grew up hearing the word mercenary, right? And you imagine these hired thugs fighting only for money. And the reality is a little more complicated than that. Now, Hessians were professional soldiers from several German states, like particularly the Hesse Castle, hired by Britain to supplement its army. They were highly trained. They were disciplined, experienced, and many had spent years fighting in Europe. They had an intimidating reputation. They were vicious. And so to the American militia soldier, they were among the finest infantry in the world. And Washington knew he couldn't defeat the main British army, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could strike one isolated garrison before anyone knew what was happening. Now, the operation itself bordered on madness, right? You happen to cross the Delaware River during the night and converge on Trenton before dawn. And only one of those forces would successfully make the crossing. Fortunately, it was Washington's. 2,400 soldiers assembled along the banks of the Delaware River near McConkey's Ferry. And waiting for them were enormous Durham boats, long, sturdy vessels normally used to transport heavy loads of iron and grain. These weren't graceful military craft. They were workboats, strong enough to carry men, cannons, horses, supplies, everything the army needed. Now, the crossing itself was made possible by one remarkable group of men you hardly hear anything about: the Marblehead Mariners from Massachusetts. These were experienced fishermen and sailors. They were led by Colonel John Glover, who had already saved Washington's army once during the miraculous evacuation from Long Island months earlier. And now they would save it again. And this attack, once they crossed, it had already started late, because by the time the last soldiers reached the Jersey shore, it was nearly 4 a.m., and they were behind schedule. But this was when the first known usage of synchronized watches came into perfect effect for Washington. Because a lot of these commanders would have called off the attack. Washington didn't. He couldn't. There was no turning back. They had to march 9 miles after all night rolling across this river through one of the worst winter storms anyone could remember at the time. Snow, freezing rain, the wind cutting through threadbare uniforms. Misery, complete hell. 2 soldiers froze to death before reaching Trenton. But as dawn broke on December 26th, 1776, Washington divided his force into 2 columns to approach Trenton from different directions. Now, the Hessians had spent Christmas celebrating. Now, contrary to popular myth, they weren't simply drunk from holiday festivities, though some officers had celebrated the night before. The real reason they were vulnerable was different. They just didn't believe any army could possibly cross the Delaware in those conditions. Nature itself was their security, and Washington turned nature into his ally. And shortly after 8 a.m., the Americans entered Trenton. And the attack was swift, confusing, violent. The Hessians scrambled to organize a defense, but they had little time. Colonel Johann Rahl, the commander, attempted to rally his troops, but was mortally wounded during the fighting. Within less than an hour, it was over. And the result stunned everyone. Approximately 900 Hessian soldiers were captured. Dozens more were killed or wounded. The Americans captured valuable muskets, cannons, powder, uniforms, and all these desperately needed supplies. And the American losses? There was only a handful of men were wounded during the combat. No deaths other than the 2 men who froze to death during the march. Yeah, crazy. It's wild. None were killed by a Hessian bullet. Now, from a military standpoint, was Trenton the largest battle of the Revolution? No way. It didn't destroy the British Army. It didn't end war. But strategically, and more important, psychologically, it may have been the single most important victory of the entire conflict. and news spread like wildfire. The impossible had happened. The Continental Army hadn't simply survived. It had struck back. Farmers who had been sitting on the fence suddenly reconsidered. There were new recruits who began joining the Army. Soldiers whose enlistments were beginning to expire agreed to stay. Washington himself personally rode before many of them and pleaded for just 6 more weeks of service. Then he sweetened the offer with a $10 bonus, money Congress could barely afford. Many stayed not because of the money, because they believed again. And a week later, Washington followed up with another stunning victory at Princeton. Once again, outmaneuvering British forces and proving Trenton hadn't been a lucky accident. The revolution had found its heartbeat. Now, looking back today, it's easy to focus on Washington's genius, and he certainly deserves enormous credit. But Trenton was won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Sailors rowing through ice, artillerymen dragging cannons through snow, farmers marching barefoot, others refusing to quit. An army that had every reason to give up, choosing instead to take one more step, then another, then another. The crossing of the Delaware has become one of America's defining moments, not because of the river itself, but because it reminds us that history often turns when people choose courage over comfort. Washington could have waited for spring. He chose action. He could have accepted defeat. He chose risk. And because of that decision, the American Revolution lived to fight another day. And there were many more battles to come between 76 and 78. That saved them. So there were so many. But that battle at Trenton, it just sent shockwaves through the colonies. You think about this, for the first time in months, Americans had something they hadn't experienced since the opening days of the Revolution: hope. Imagine church bells ringing across the countryside, newspapers celebrating. People who had begun accepting British victory suddenly started asking a different question. What if we can actually win this? But George Washington understood something most people didn't. One victory wouldn't save the revolution. Yes, Trenton had inspired the country. But if the British immediately crushed the Continental Army afterward, that inspiration would disappear almost as quickly as it arrived. And Washington needed another victory. And not because he was greedy, but he understood momentum. Wars aren't fought with just muskets, with rifles. They're fought with confidence, morale, and belief. And after months of defeat, the American people desperately needed something to believe in. And believe me, the British, well, they knew this too. And General Charles Cornwallis, one of Britain's finest commanders, was furious after Trenton. He gathered approximately 8,000 veteran soldiers and marched toward New Jersey with one objective: destroy Washington's army, finish the rebellion once and for all. We're not waiting until spring. And by the early January of 1777, Cornwallis caught up with Washington near the Assunpink Creek, just outside of Trenton. The Americans occupied the opposite bank, and several British assaults attempted to force a crossing, and each one was beaten back. And as darkness fell on January 2nd, Cornwallis looked across the creek at the American camp and reportedly told his officers, "At last we have run down the old fox, and we will bag him in the morning." Now, and you have to understand, from Britain's perspective, Washington had nowhere to go. The Delaware River lay behind him. Cornwallis blocked the road ahead. Superior British numbers surrounded him. The revolution appeared trapped. And if Cornwallis attacked at daybreak, Washington's army would almost certainly be destroyed. Now, most commanders would have spent the night preparing for one final desperate battle, but not George. Washington had something entirely different in mind. He wasn't going to stay. He was going to disappear. That evening, the Continental Army did something extraordinary. Instead of retreating in panic, they just quietly slipped away. Campfires continued burning. Small groups remained behind, Soldiers kept making noise. Shovels struck the frozen ground. Wagons moved just enough to convince British sentries that the Americans were preparing defensive positions for the next day's battle. And it was a brilliant deception. And while Cornwallis believed Washington was trapped in front of him, the Continental Army quietly marched around the British flank, not away from danger, toward another opportunity. The march, it was brutal, and the roads were frozen solid. Artillery and wagons had to move silently over the frozen ground. One mistake, one careless sound, one British patrol discovered him, and the entire plan would collapse. And yet somehow, the army moved undetected. And by sunrise on January 3rd of 1777, Washington's army approached the town of Princeton. It was there that they encountered British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Malwood. The fighting began almost immediately, and at first things went badly. American militia at the front of the column began falling back under disciplined British fire for a brief moment. It did look as though the victory at Trenton might be erased. And then George Washington did something that became legendary. Rather than directing the battle from the rear, he rode directly toward the fighting. Eyewitnesses describe Washington riding his white horse between his retreating soldiers and advancing the British line. Now imagine this scene. And you have to remember, George Washington is a large man, standing at 6'2". He's a big man, especially for the time. He had to have looked almost like a giant on this white steed. There's musket fire erupting all around him. Smoke's covering the battlefield. Men were running. Officers struggled to restore order. And there in the middle of it all was George Washington, calm, visible, exposed. One officer later recalled Washington being so close to the British that everyone watching expected him to be killed. Others were saying silent prayers because they believed their commander wouldn't survive. And Washington reportedly called out to his men, "Parade with us, my brave fellows. There is but a handful of the enemy, and we shall have them directly." And inspired by his presence, the Continental soldiers rallied. Instead of continuing their retreat, they turned, they advanced, and they drove the British back. And within a short time, the Americans had secured Princeton. Several hundred British soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. And more importantly, Washington once again defeated professional British troops. And the military significance of Princeton often gets overshadowed by Trenton. But together, those two battles, the retreat in the middle of the night, that silent slipping away from Cornwallis's army, when everything looked like the Continental Army looked defeated just right before Christmas. And now 2 weeks later, they won 2 stunning victories against one of the greatest armies in the world. And even more remarkable was how Washington had accomplished it. He hadn't simply fought harder. He had fought smarter. He understood that Britain expected European-style warfare. Large armies, open fields, predictable maneuvers. Instead, Washington relied on surprise, speed, intelligence, flexibility. He attacked where the enemy felt safest, moved when they expected him to stay, disappeared when they thought they had him trapped. It became the defining characteristic of his military leadership. Fight only when the odds make sense. Preserve the army. Live to fight another day. Washington knew something many commanders throughout history have forgotten. The Continental Army didn't need to conquer Britain. It simply needed to survive long enough for Britain to give up. Every soldier saved today could fight tomorrow. Every unnecessary battle avoided kept the revolution alive. That philosophy frustrated many Americans at the time. Some wanted dramatic victories, decisive battles, heroic charges, but Washington thought differently. Lose one battle, you might recover. Lose your army, the revolution ends. And Princeton also transformed George Washington's reputation. Because before these victories, there were many people who questioned whether he was the right man to command. He had lost New York. He retreated across New Jersey. He's seen thousands of his men desert. And critics were whispering that perhaps Congress had chosen poorly. But after Trenton and Princeton, those whispers began disappearing. His soldiers started believing not only in the cause, but the man leading it. Trust had been earned, and not through speeches, through action. History often remembers dramatic moments, the crossing of the Delaware, Washington on horseback, the famous painting. But perhaps Washington's greatest achievement wasn't winning battles. It was giving a defeated people permission to believe again. The victories at Trenton, at Princeton, proved something priceless. The British could be beaten. Now, the revolution wasn't over. America wasn't finished. In fact, it was just getting started. Because of these victories, the French, who were sitting on the sidelines, finally decided to get invested in the war. Because why not? Your arch enemy Britain is taking defeats at the hands of these wild Americans, these upstarts. We can help them and get a little of our swagger back. And imagine being Britain and seeing this. Seeing what happened. What was going to happen to them. And there were so many more. So many more battles. And I urge you, if you're a patriot of this country, you love this country, and you really truly want to know the United States of America and why, when we celebrate, this is only the 250th anniversary of this country. We've only been a country for 250 years, and already one of the greatest nations to ever exist. And that's a bold statement, but it's also a true statement. Why? Because of the freedoms and how we exist. And everybody wants to point at all the stuff happening today. Oh, is America? America's terrible. America's this. America's the only country that gives you the right and the ability to say that and not be put in prison for your words. All the opportunities and things you have today are because of what happened 250 plus years ago. It's a privilege to be born American. It's a privilege to be an American, to live in this country. Despite any hardships that you may have at times, despite things you may or may not like, and those are always going to be the case, to be an American is one of the absolute greatest things you can be on this planet. There's no other country on this planet like the United States of America. And we're getting ready to celebrate our 250th anniversary. And it's amazing. It's amazing. And when you look back on that, at how America survived against impossible odds, from just colonies, self-run little mini countries that were over here, to becoming a nation. I mean, history has a way of making the impossible seem inevitable. We know how the story ends. We know there will eventually be a victory at Yorktown. We know George Washington becomes America's first president. We know the United States survives. But the men and women living through those years knew none of that. That's what makes this period of American history so remarkable. There was no guarantee. There was no certainty. There was no promise that everything would somehow work out in the end. Every decision they made without knowing whether they would succeed. Think about where we started tonight, December of 1776. Washington's army was retreating. The British had won battle after battle. Congress had fled Philadelphia. Soldiers were deserting. Men were barefoot, hungry, cold. Many hadn't been paid in months. The revolution wasn't simply struggling, it was dying. Had you asked most military experts in Europe who would win that war, nearly all of them would have answered the same way, Britain, without hesitation. And the odds wouldn't even have been close. Remember, the British possessed the greatest navy on earth at the time. Professional armies, experienced generals, and virtually unlimited resources. And what did the Americans possess? Courage. They had a handful of cannons and an idea. And yet, over those next 2 years, something extraordinary happened. Washington refused to quit. When everyone expected him to retreat, he crossed the Delaware. When the British believed they had him trapped, he marched around them and struck Princeton. When Britain believed one decisive campaign would split the colonies apart, Saratoga changed the course of history. When winter threatened to destroy the Continental Army, Valley Forge transformed it into a professional fighting force. And when America desperately needed a friend, France decided this young nation was worth believing in. Every one of those moments mattered. Remove any of them, and history might look completely different. If Washington fails at Trenton, does the Army survive? If Burgoyne wins at Saratoga, does France ever join the war? Because it was that moment where France truly said, we're in. And if Valley Forge breaks the Continental Army instead of strengthening it, who fights the campaigns that follow? History often turns on moments that seem insignificant at the time. A frozen river, a winter camp, a battlefield in upstate New York, a diplomat sitting in a Paris drawing room. Small moments, world-changing consequences. And there's another lesson here that often gets overlooked. The American Revolution wasn't won because Americans were always stronger, because in many cases, they weren't. It wasn't won because they always had better weapons. They didn't. And it wasn't won because they had more soldiers. Most of the time, they had fewer. They won because they adapted, because they learned, because they persevered, because they refused to surrender after the defeat. And that, by God, is the American way. George Washington understood something that many military leaders throughout history never fully grasped. You don't have to win every battle. You simply have to keep your cause alive long enough to win the war. And that's exactly what they did. He preserved his army when others would have gambled everything. He accepted temporary defeats in order to secure ultimate victory. He survived spies bickering within his own camp. And he inspired loyalty, not because he never failed, but because he never stopped leading. And that may be his greatest legacy. It's not perfection. It's perseverance. And to me, that's perhaps the greatest lesson that this chapter of American history still offers us today. Every generation faces moments when the future looks uncertain, when the challenge seems overwhelming, when giving up appears easier than pressing forward. I mean, the generation that fought the revolution faced those moments again and again. They buried friends. They endured hunger, disease, cold, defeat, disappointment. Yet somehow they kept moving. One step, one march, one battle, one winner, one sacrifice at a time. The United States wasn't built because everything went according to plan. It was built because ordinary people refused to abandon extraordinary principles. They believed liberty was worth sacrifice. They believed self-government was worth fighting for. They believed future generations deserved something better than what they themselves had inherited. And because they believed those things, the United States survived its darkest years. And as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of America's founding, it's worth remembering that our nation's story didn't begin with guaranteed success. It began with uncertainty. It survived through resilience. And it was strengthened by people who refused to quit when quitting would have been the easier choice. And that is the real story of 1776 through 1778. Not just a story of battles, not just a story of generals, but the story of perseverance. Because sometimes history isn't changed by the strongest. It's changed by those who simply refuse to stay down. And that may be the most American story of all. And so I ask you, going into our 250th year, if you have been one of Washington's soldiers on Christmas night in 1776, knowing the odds, the freezing weather, and you might not never make it home, would you have crossed the Delaware? It's hard to believe. George Washington once said, perseverance and spirit have done wonders in all ages. Do you think perseverance is still one of America's greatest strengths today? Or have we become too comfortable as a society? I'd love to hear your answers. Leave us your comments. Send us your responses. I'd love to know. When we began this journey tonight, America had declared its independence. And in this episode, we watched it fight for survival against impossible odds, against the greatest empire on earth, against hunger and cold and disease, even doubt itself. But the revolution endured, not because victory was guaranteed, but because enough ordinary people believed freedom was worth one more march, one more battle, one more sacrifice. I appreciate you guys tuning into this episode. And take a moment this Independence Day to appreciate not only the victories, but the sacrifices that made them possible. Because freedom has never belonged to the strongest. It has always belonged to those willing to fight for it. So from all of us here at the FAFO Podcast, happy Independence Day. We'll see you next time. And remember, you're listening to the Fuck Around and Find Out podcast. Facts, truth, no BS. Let's effing go.
Four on the floor, have a tank of gas. Does he boots on the wood, let the whiskey pass? I ain't preaching from a pulpit, I'm talking from the scar. You can dress up a lie, but it won't get far. They call it toxic when it burns your tongue. I call it true when it's finally sung.